Hello, and welcome to episode 434 of the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. My name is Seth Perrin, historian and deputy director of the Mississippi Armed Forces Museum. And with me, as always, is my esteemed co-host, retired Navy Captain Bill Tody, former skipper of the fast attack submarine USS Indianapolis, Commodore of Submarine Squadron 3 in Pearl Harbor, and many others. How are you this January 23rd, Bill?
I was doing my best Cosmo Kramer point there, Seth.
I too am a fan of Seinfeld.
Yeah.
How's the weather in your neck of the woods today, Bill?
No, I tell you, I was outside trying to get my generator fixed, not the Wi-Fi and my generator fixed. It works. And the watch tells me it's 54 degrees. That's 5'4", but it feels really cold. And I know it was like 8 degrees where you're something like that, where you were crazy cold. So
Stupid
I
cold.
can't complain, Seth, but it seemed cold to me.
It was damn cold by us. We got 8 inches of snow in southeast Louisiana. In Mandeville, Louisiana, we had 8 inches of snow, and the lowest of the lows in my backyard was 12 degrees,
hmm hmm
which
So
which
my
is
brother's
cold
one of these.
anywhere.
Yeah. My brother's one of these people when it's 90 degrees in summertime in August here in Florida. He says, "Oh, I could never live down there. I much prefer the cold to the hot." And so I messaged him and said, "It's 10 degrees where you are right now. You better be outside enjoying it because I can be outside and enjoying it when it's 90 here."
Yeah, yeah.
I don't think he was.
We went outside on Tuesday during the snow because it's a rare event down
Mhm.
where we live, and the kids loved it, and we all did. We all had a good time. But I told my wife, I said, yeah, I said today was fun, but tomorrow, which of course was yesterday, is going to suck because all this snow is going to turn to slush and it's going to turn to ice,
Mhm.
and that is precisely
Mhm.
what happened. And that's yeah, it was
Of course.
yeah. But anyway, cool experience all the same.
Yep.
So, Bill, we are going to record this episode, and then the next time I see you will be, well, no, we're going to record next week, but then after that, I'll see you in person in San Diego.
We sure will. We'll be there. But this episode's going to air after we've already come
Correct.
back, Seth.
Correct.
Yeah.
It is. It is.
Yeah.
It is.
So
But
I will have enjoyed seeing you, Seth,
same,
by the time this
same,
episode airs.
same indeed. Indeed. And with John too, partial. He'll be there with us too.
Yeah. hmm
So, all right. Well, on with today's show. And this is Bill. As I was going through this one, I kind of figured this is going to be one of those ones that people say, "Damn, I didn't know anything about this." So hopefully you're enlightened somewhat. So here we go. So they steamed in column just offshore as if on parade. Devoid of any concern, the ships were both a symbol and bait, as well as a middle finger to the Japanese. Majestically, the ships slid in the placid waters, drew close inshore, and trained their turrets to starboard and awaited the order to open fire. All hands aboard the ships realized the significance of the moment. Here they were, within visual range of the enemy coast, ready to deal destruction, and for most, there wasn't a care in the world. Quite the contrary, there was excitement. Finally, at 10 minutes after 12 on July 14th, 1945, the order was given, with the hoisting of the signal flags that read, and I quote, "Never forget Pearl Harbor." The 16-inch 45 caliber main battery of battleships South Dakota roared, followed quickly by Indiana and Massachusetts. The mighty battle wagons of Admiral William F. Halsey's Third Fleet and their escorts poured shell after shell into the steel mills on Japan's home shores. Considering who was in charge of the fleet, that being Admiral Halsey, the bombardment could be assumed to be a flex, as the kids say, but it wasn't, at least not entirely. It was strategic and important for the upcoming operation, the largest amphibious invasion of the war thus far planned, Operation Olympic. In an oft-forgotten display of naval power, the likes of which will never be seen again, the mighty U.S. Third Fleet's battleships, along with their friends from the Royal Navy and Royal New Zealand Navy, pounded targets on Japan's home shores for the first time in the empire's long history. Well, I shouldn't say that. It's in the first time in over 100 years. The naval bombardments of Japan signaled the opening round of Operation Olympic, an invasion that nobody on either side wanted to happen. Bill, this is one of those things that you don't talk about too often, but it's cool. Well, it's all part of the grand scheme.
It is, Seth. I was on mute. But here's the deal. We're talking about July 1945. In a few short weeks, the two atomic bombs would be dropped, but we're gonna extend beyond that date in this conversation. So keep a strategic outlook here. Okinawa is done. Bill Halsey has taken back command of Third Fleet. It was Fifth Fleet when Spruance had it. In June of 45, after the conclusion of the campaign for Okinawa, Spruance led that one to completion. The Okinawa campaign ended, and then Third Fleet is now centered around the fast carriers of Task Force 38, was 58, under the command of not Mitchell, but Admiral John McCain. You're going to say, but wait, Bill, you told me that McCain had been fired after the second hurricane. The second hurricane has happened, but the firing hasn't happened yet.
Right. Yeah.
And Task Force 38, at this point, for the most part, is sitting idle. They return to Leyte. Halsey's fleet begins to rest, recuperate, and replenish from the long and arduous and bloody Okinawa campaign. Remember, Halsey once said that it's like you change riders, but they're the same horses.
Yep.
And these horses are tired. They'd endured under the command of Admiral Spruance's terrible campaign at Okinawa. The kamikazes had ravaged the third, then fifth fleets, and now it's the Third Fleet again, inflicting casualties on the likes of which the U.S. Navy had not seen since the dark days off the shores of Guadalcanal way back in 42, when we were worried, really worried about surviving, about saving the last vestiges of our carrier fleet. Now we've got a whole lot more carriers now, but we're taking a pounding again because of those kamikazes. The R&R, a generation later, would call it R&R. It's still called rest and recuperation. This was needed for both men and the ships, Seth.
Yeah, it was. And I mean, again, you put it perfectly. If you go back and you think about what time period this is, June 45, um, the U.S. Navy, the Fifth Fleet had just been operating at a constant level since March, and they really hadn't stopped. I mean, groups had rotated in and out, but for the most part, these guys were under, the gas pedal was down 24 hours a day. So the men obviously welcomed the respite, but Halsey, always looking for a fight, did not. He was chomping at the bit to get after the Japanese. Again, he was keenly aware that Spruance had brought Fifth Fleet, the same ships, to Japan's home island shores just a few months earlier. And, I'm fairly confident in saying that Bill Halsey had a case of, as we called it, FOMO, fear of missing out, because Spruance had done it and he wanted to do it too. He wanted to hit Japan too. And, the last time that Halsey had been anywhere close to Japan, of course, was April 1942 when he led the Doolittle Raid Task Force out to, 700 some odd miles from the coast of Japan before Doolittle launched his 25. So he wanted to get out there and do some work. So the rest did not sit very well with him, nor did it sit very well with his boss, Chet Nimitz. Nimitz wanted to get people out there too, didn't he, Bill? He didn't want people to sit around either.
He did. It's all about keeping up the pressure,
Mhm.
keeping them off their feet like a good boxer, right? Jab, 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 jab. Never let up, because if you let up, they can kind of recover, get their senses about them. They can generate a plan. You don't want them to have the time to generate a plan. So aware that the men and ships needed the rest, but also, excuse me, you tell I'm having voice problems, Seth. But they're also aware that to have the fleet idle would be a waste of both men and ships. Nimitz does order Halsey to do what Halsey wanted to do: plan for strikes against the home islands to commence in July and continue at least through August. Now, at this point of the war, the only people who had seen the islands of Japan, submariners through their periscopes, Army Air Forces, and those big B-29s, and some Corsairs as well. And, Spruance got a glimpse of them during his time. naval air forces flying off of carriers saw the home islands, but Halsey wasn't in any of those packages, right? So he wants to see those islands for himself. Strikes by the Third Fleet would center around the fast carriers and would hit targets from Tokyo to Kure. Kure was especially inviting to Halsey, who salivated at the chance to sink the pitiful few capital ships left, mainly the couple of remaining battleships that are left of the Imperial Navy. And while Nimitz agreed that the remnants of the IGN should be eliminated once and for all, he saw the overall implications for this operation as being farther reaching than just sinking ships. Seth, this is the IGN at this point is almost irrelevant.
Pretty much.
Nimitz is trying to send strategic signals, not tactical victories.
Correct. Yeah, 100%. And Nimitz, he's always got the binoculars strapped to his eyes. He can see a lot further than most people could. And the IGN, yeah, 100% right, is almost irrelevant at this point. They're impotent. They can't do anything. They don't have any fuel or not enough fuel to really do anything of any value. And a lot of their ships are in poor maintenance at that stage and can't just get out there and go do things. And we'll talk about that next week when we talk about the Curie Naval Harbor raids and things like that. But exactly to your point, they were pretty much done. Nimitz assumed, and he was 100% right, that the Japanese kamikaze threat was not finished. Nimitz ordered Halsey to focus his attention on potential kamikaze airfields. His goal in this was to try and eliminate as much of the threat, makes perfect sense, eliminate as much of the threat as possible before the American invasion of Kyushu, known as Operation Olympic, that was scheduled, by the way, for October. So it was coming up, relatively quickly. Nimitz could see the bloody writing on the walls if thousands of Japanese aircraft threw themselves against packed American troop ships and cargo ships, a tactic which the Japanese had just obviously shifted to towards the end of the Okinawa campaign. Thus, the airfields that dotted Honshu and Kyushu were the main targets, them and their aircraft themselves, obviously, by destroying the airfield infrastructure, as well as the aircraft that they could find, keyword find. Third Fleet could significantly reduce Japanese kamikaze ability by October when the invasion was set to kick off. Aside from airfields, Japanese defensive infrastructure, specifically industrial plants beyond the range of LeMay's B-29s, and also some of those within the range of LeMay's B-29s, were also of vital importance and put on Halsey's target list. This is where today's topic comes in. Among those defensive infrastructure targets were ironworks and steel mills that were known to exist along the eastern coast of Japan, namely Honshu. An obvious choice for airstrikes, the steel mills at Kashiro and on Hokkaido, Kamaishi, Muroran, Hitachi, Nojimasaki, Hamamatsu, and Shimizu were all put on the target list. However, these targets would not see the presence of marauding American naval aircraft, would they, Bill?
Yeah, so we didn't need to. It's a short story here. It's kind of the interesting thing, the way this develops, Seth. The main goal for the upcoming operation was clear to Halsey: draw out and destroy Japanese aircraft as well as the facilities that were outlined on the target list. So again, he's going to basically send in some decoys. He's going to hope that kamikaze airplanes come out and go after those decoys. Now, you've got two ways of shooting down those kamikazes. First one is what we've been doing all along, which is carrier aircraft fighters attacking the airplanes as they come out. The second one, though, and we talked about this so much with John Parshall, is our defensive anti-air at this point of the war on those ships was so robust. Go back and look at John Parshall's graphics on how much lead these battleships could throw up into the air to shoot down anything that's coming in. We could throw up so much lead, even without those fighter air cover, that Halsey felt pretty good about his ability to keep the fleet safe as they steamed in close to shore. But he's going to have those airplanes there just in case. But predominantly, this is going to be the surface combatants going in and then beaten the bejesus out of these shore targets. That's what this is all about. And the opposition to American strikes on the home islands had diminished significantly since March of 1945. American leadership assumed that the reason for the lack of opposition to be twofold. Number one, lack of available resources. And number two, the husbanding of what they did have left for the defense of the Kyushu. And it was more number two than number one in this regard, wasn't it, Seth?
For sure, absolutely. Yeah, and they were both correct to a degree, but yeah, it was more what you said than the reality. With the loss of over 8,000 aircraft since January 1945, the Japanese aerial defense capability was actually reeling. What remained of the aerial component of Japan's final defense was being husbanded for said final defense. No question about that at all. Halsey knew that in order to bring out Japanese aircraft, a juicy target had to be laid on the table. The juicy target, as you were saying, Bill, that Halsey was going to give the Japanese were his battleships, or at least some of them. And before anybody, sits there and says that, Bill Halsey's deliberately sacrificing his American ships and da 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 and all, so no, that is exactly what he's doing, but that's part of the plan. It's all part of the game here. He did not want to risk his carriers any more than he would have to in the first place. And he also figured, just like you said, Bill, that the battle wagons of all the surface ships have more than enough AAA to defend themselves against just about any kind of threat environment that they're going to put themselves in, number one. Number two, as we've said multiple times, that if a battleship takes a hit, it can take it as opposed to a carrier. One or two kamikazes on a battle wagon is going to suck, but it's not going to knock it out of action where it would on a carrier. But just in case, Bill Halsey is going to throw destroyers and cruisers in there to screen these battle wagons, and he is going to provide some combat air patrol with these guys, for these guys, just in case. To this point, in the war, the fast battleships had been used mainly for screening the fast carriers. They had bombarded shore installations on most of the Central Pacific drives, calling stops at places like Saipan, Tinian, Guam, Peleliu, etc. But for the most part, they had ridden herd with the carriers and provided AAA screening for the invaluable aircraft carriers. This would be their chance to shine. In May 1945, the guy that we've talked about since season one that we all love and adore, Admiral Willis Ching Lee, was detached from his beloved fast battleships and sent back home. He obviously was the Navy's foremost gunnery expert, and he had been at sea pretty much continuously since November 1942. He had been tasked with the development of more effective anti-kamikaze, anti-aircraft artillery. Lee's absence was felt by more than one sailor aboard the battleships, but as I put in the notes, his replacement was no schmuck, was he, Bill?
He wasn't. Yeah, yeah. But getting back to Lee for a second,
Mm,
let that sink in. This dude had been at sea for almost 3 years.
yes.
Okay? Folks complain about 6-month deployments these days. Three, count them, years, folks. Yeah, he got ashore occasionally. But my goodness, he'd been deployed for almost 3 years. Now, his replacement, as you said, was no schmuck. His name was John F. Shafroth Jr. Or would you pronounce it Safroth? I think you tell me, Seth.
I have no idea.
Yeah,
Tomato,
I'm pretty sure.
tomato.
Yeah, exactly. So this dude is born in 1887, the son of a Colorado senator, and he had no problem acquiring an appointment to Annapolis in 1904. John F. Shafroth Jr., a mountain of a man, all 280 pounds of him, yep, 280, is about almost as big enough to be an NFL tackle.
That's a big boy.
He's a big boy. He starred at the academy in most sports. No surprise. Heavyweight boxing and wrestling, as well as football, of course. And of all things, a high hurdler. I would have loved to have seen that. Shafroth was beloved by his classmates, among whom were Willis Lee,
Mhm.
some other guys you might have heard of, Thomas Kincaid, Richmond Kelly Turner. We've talked about him a lot. John is a big fan of
Mhm.
Richmond Kelly Turner. I'm exaggerating for effect there. So serving aboard battleships and destroyers for the early part of his career, Saffroth then spent time at the Bureau of Steam Engineering before taking command of USS Terry, making numerous transatlantic convoy crossings at the height of the U-boat threat in World War I. Like many of his classmates, he served on surface ships, of course, gunboats, all through the interwar years, while also attending the Naval War College and the Army War College as well, which is very unusual, by the way, folks. Through the remainder of the 1930s, Saffroth bounced around to various duties at BUNAV, Bureau of Navigation, and other ships before taking command of my favorite ship, USS Indianapolis, in 1938. Serving as NDCO until 1940, he went back to BUNAV and reported directly to the future SINCPAC himself, who was the director of BUNAV, Admiral Chester Nimitz. And Nimitz took an intense liking to Saffroth. So when Pearl Harbor was attacked, Saffroth assumed command of Cruiser Division 3 before being appointed CO of the commanding admiral of Southeast Pacific area until 42, when he was ordered back to Pearl Harbor to work for his old boss, Nimitz. Nimitz appointed his old friend as deputy commander, South Pac area under Halsey until March of 44, when the rear admiral was appointed to Inspector General of Pacific Fleet until December. So here's the guy that both Nimitz and Halsey knew well. He worked for both of them. So this seems like a good fit, doesn't it, Seth?
It does. And this is one of those guys that we haven't talked about often because he didn't see a lot of combat until the very end of the war. But he was more than qualified. He was intensely qualified to do that very type of thing. And it wasn't until December 26th, 1944, that he was finally, and he wanted one, like but specifically and continuously requested a combat assignment, but because of his organizational skills, he was not allowed to go to combat. Basically, Chester Nimitz was like, I really need you here, dude. So he kept him in rein. But he finally granted him his wish. And on the day after Christmas 44, he was given combat assignment when he was appointed commanding officer of Bat Div 8, Battleship Division 8, built around the battleships USS Massachusetts, BB-59, Indiana, BB-58, and Alabama, BB-60. Alabama was later replaced by South Dakota, which became his flagship. Like all fast battleship commanders, he operated with the fast carriers for the remainder of that year until he was assigned to take Willis Lee's place in May. In June, he was given command of Task Group 34.8.1, which consisted of battleships South Dakota, Indiana, and Massachusetts, along with the cruisers Quincy, CA-71, and Chicago, CA-136, as well as 9 destroyers. Of course, Quincy and Chicago are 2 cruisers in 1942 that were sunk off the waters of Guadalcanal. These are new ships that have been built and not renamed, but named after the ships that were sunk in 42. Halsey informed Saffroth that his task group would have the honor and responsibility of conducting the first United States naval shore bombardment of the Japanese home islands and would subsequently attack the ironworks at Kushiro on Hokkaido. Target date for the attack would be July 10th, 1945, in concert with aerial strikes by the fast carriers in the same area. But, Bill, as you always say, plans do not survive contact with the enemy, and that is exactly what happens here.
Yeah, now to most of our viewers, listeners will know this, but Hokkaido, of course, is the northernmost big island of Japan. So, right, in the previous attacks, we were going after targets on the southern islands, but here they're supposed to vector veer north. Okay, so change of plans that you're talking about, Seth. Aboard Sodak, South Dakota, Commander Edward Matthews, who is the combat intel officer on the staff of the now departed Admiral Willis Lee, saw the orders from Halsey stated that Kushiro would be the first target of the bombardment force and immediately frowned. Matthews had recalled reading intel reports to the effect that Kushiro factories were essentially abandoned. Digging through the papers, he finds the intel that suggested that the factory had actually been dismantled and moved away from the coast, so they wouldn't be as easy to target. So before he approached Halsey with this info, he wanted confirmation. Having worked directly with General Curtis LeMay's combat intel officer, a man named Lieutenant Colonel John Hawes, Matthews decided to call in a favor. Making the call, Matthews requested that LeMay's recon element fly over the area and see if the factory was still there or not. Matthews recalled, quote, "We departed Leyte on 1 July, bound for Japan, having received no further word. My heart sank when I thought of the waste of time, fuel, and money involved in bringing this immense force hundreds of miles to an empty target. On the afternoon of the first day out, however, a destroyer came boiling alongside with special intelligence material for Commander Matthews. A big sack came across the line and was dumped in my room. Colonel Haas had delivered the goods," unquote. So Matthews continued. Husted, a fellow intel officer who had come aboard the night before, and I fell on the sack and tore open the envelopes there. We found our assigned target with only a blotch on the photographs where the big steel plant had been. Incontrovertible interpretation, I love that word, from the 21st Bomber Command declaring the target worthless. I love that word, Seth, because you almost never get intelligence that's incontrovertible. So it's a rarely used word. So he continues, I wrote out a dispatch to the Third Fleet for Admiral Safroth's signature, and we brought him and the Chief of Staff the photos and the report. There could be no argument, but it seemed up to us to name a tentative replacement target. I suggested Kamaishi, a steel town on the Honshu coast. After some discussion, we signaled Third Fleet, proposed the change of target, and gave our reasons. We received prompt authorization and fell to work preparing for a bombardment of Kamaishi in 2 days, unquote. Now, Seth, that sounds easy, right? You just change from one target to another. It is not easy. You got to map out coordinates. You got to map out ranges. You got to map out firing distances. You got to map out firing placements, bombardment screens. There's a lot that goes into shifting these targets, and they didn't have much time to prepare for it.
No, they did not. But as we're going to see, they did a hell of a job. So the target, the Kamaishi plant that he's talking about, that Bill was talking about, was a very important target to the Japanese, or an important mill, rather, to the Japanese. Since the early 1930s, the town with its foundry and steel mill had played a vital role in the Japanese war machine effort. The population of the town was about 40,000 people, and the vast majority of those 40,000 people worked either in the fishing industry or for the steel mill. That's pretty much all they did, one or the other. Owned by the Nippon Steel Company, the Kamaishi plant had produced steel at a high rate for the Imperial Japanese Navy until 1944, early 1944. By then, due to American submarine sinkings of valuable cargo ships carrying coking coal, the plant had significantly reduced its productivity and was now operating at around 50% capacity. All of this is completely unknown to the Americans, however, and the plant was viewed, and rightfully so, as a valuable target for the surface ships to bombard. Another unknown thing for the Americans, and this is of course tragic, was the fact that the Japanese had established two prisoner of war camps in the town of Kamaishi itself. The prisoners were mainly American prisoners of war. They were used as slave labor for the steel mills and were camped in close proximity to the mills and therefore directly in the American target area. On July 10th, 1945, Task Force 38 fast carriers conducted raids in northern Japan and, much to their surprise and kind of chagrin, encountered little to no Japanese aerial resistance. Most Japanese airfields were deserted, and those that did have aircraft were nearly impervious to the ranging American aircraft as the airplanes were tucked into revetments or hidden in nearby forests. Only 100 Japanese aircraft were claimed destroyed on July 10th raids, a major disappointment to Halsey and his aviators. However, the lack of Japanese aerial resistance emboldened the already bold Halsey to believe that his bombardment force of surface ships would not encounter any aerial resistance and therefore not achieve the goal of drawing out Japanese defenses. He's got every right to think that when you think about it, Bill. I mean, he sends a whole friggin' Task Force 38 fast carrier task strike group, and they encounter virtually nothing. So his whole reason for bringing the battleships out there is to draw out Japanese aircraft. Well, if the American carrier aircraft aren't going to do it, the battleships probably aren't going to do it either. So it makes perfect sense. He contemplated, Halsey contemplated canceling the bombardments and apparently went to Nimitz for advice. He was like, I don't really think we need to do this, but Nimitz told Halsey that he had a free hand. He could do whatever he wanted. And Halsey being Halsey, of course, he decides he wants to pull the trigger.
When did he not pull the trigger? This is
Exactly.
Halsey
Yeah.
we're talking about, right? Yeah. Give me an opportunity, boss, and I'm going to take it. So, ranging down the coast, Halsey hit targets from Hokkaido to Honshu and everything in between. Refueling on the 12th, Halsey detached Shafroth's battleships and their screen and ordered them to hit Kamaishi on the 14th in broad daylight. Commander Matthews recalls, we picked up the coast of Honshu and in the gray dawn of 14 July and bore down at high speed on the unsuspecting little city. Our force constituted a formidable phalanx of gray ships. Are they gray or blue at this point? With spray screaming over the bows and signal flags snapping at the halyards. Formidable indeed. Sodak, Indiana, and Big Mamie, by the way, Big Mamie was the nickname for USS Massachusetts because Mamie Eisenhower was the sponsor of the Massachusetts. And I'm not quite sure Big Mamie wasn't a comical name, but that's okay. Big Mamie, along with 2 cruisers and 9 destroyers, provided enough kaboom to lay serious waste to the target. As the force slid along the Japanese coast in the morning light, Shafroth ordered signal flags rung up his flagship, South Dakota. The flags spelled out the message, as you said earlier, Seth, never forget Pearl Harbor. If that didn't energize the crews, nothing would.
Yeah.
Above the surface force, a 20 aircraft combat air patrol flew from 38.1. Halsey had decided the night before that an aerial escort was necessary after all, Seth.
Yeah. Think about that for a minute. You got these battleship sailors who, most of them had seen, at the very least, anti-aircraft combat time, and they'd shelled islands before, but still, most of these guys, unless there were a few old salts on Sodak from the battleship fight, which there probably were, they hadn't really gotten their licks in on the Japanese to their desire. And dude rings up the flags, never forget Pearl Harbor. Yeah, that's going to provide the juice needed to get things done. So initially, a surface haze, limited visibility to 14 to 20,000 yards. Shafroth did not want to get too close to the shore for fear of mines, and it was a very legitimate fear. He directed that all fire would be radar directed because they could not see at this point in time the actual target with their naked eye. So at 12:10, he ordered his battle wagons to commence firing. South Dakota was the first to let her main battery roar. Seconds after Shafroth gave the order, signalman first class Glenn Arnold and the main battery plot pressed the trigger that sent the first 16-inch salvo onto the Kamaishi steelworks on mainland Japan. Indiana and Massachusetts followed suit seconds later and began to pump round after round after round into the center of the steel mill. Sailing in column, the American force was completely unmolested by Japanese defenses. Coastal batteries on and around Kamaishi could not open fire as the American ships were initially at 26,000 yards when they opened fire, when our ships opened fire. With each passing of the column, however, the Americans drew ever closer to shore. That being said, the coastal batteries were still of no use against the battleships and even the destroyers, who drew in very close and pumped 5 inches into anything they could find, which included some Japanese ships that tried to escape the shelling. Commander Matthews again recalled, quote, as we rounded onto the bombardment track, I was surprised to see a large merchant ship high in the water emerge from the mouth of the inner bay. She was followed by 2 others, then by a minuscule gunboat which had the impertinence to poop tiny shells at us that fell halfway. They'd sneaked in since the last photo reconnaissance. The screen was screaming for permission to release batteries. None of them had ever encountered so juicy a target. Just then, we opened fire on the mill with the 16-inch guns, and either someone cut the screen loose or they just couldn't stand it any longer. Above the Americans, spotter planes from USS Chicago spotted the fall of shot and coached the big battle wagon's guns closer in. Within minutes, 16-inch hits were noted on target on open hearths, coke ovens, foundries, a rolling mill, and other steel mill infrastructure. An oil tanker, a small ship, and two barges in the harbor were also sunk by battleship gunfire, Bill. Battle wagons bringing down the thunder here.
They are indeed, Seth. And as the shells continue to rain down for the next 2 hours, numerous fires were started across the town. The wooden structures typical of Japan burned furiously and sent up huge columns of smoke that obscured the spotter plane's ability to direct the naval shelling. Still, the Americans kept throwing shells into the area, into the smoke, a lot of them. Over the course of the shelling until the U.S. ships ceased fire at 1419, 802 16-inch, 728 8-inch, and 825 5-inch shells were sent at the Kamaishi works and the surrounding areas. So almost as many 16-inch shells were fired as 5-inch shells were fired. So initial assessments of the shelling were poor due to the area recon, the smoke, and all of that. However, post-war review showed that the shelling on July 14th was extremely effective. The steel mill had been heavily damaged, causing the factory to cease production altogether for the remainder of the war. 4 weeks worth of pig iron production was destroyed, and 2.5 months worth of coal was also destroyed in the fires. The fires that were started in the town destroyed hundreds of buildings of all sorts and killed 424 Japanese civilians, a fact that the Japanese news media played to the hilt. 34 American prisoners of war, sadly, were also killed in the 2-hour shelling. American press heralded the attack with the New York Times saying, quote, "Today, the people of Japan saw for themselves the might of the United States Navy and the fragments of steel and masonry that hurtled through the air symbolized for them the final disintegration of their Imperial Navy's mythical invincibility. Once finished, the task group turned around and then sped to rejoin the remainder of Task Force 38. However, the naval bombardments of the home islands had just begun." Seth, in an earlier episode, I tried doing my best BBC voice. I do not have a voice for radio, I'm telling you that. And I'm having a particularly bad voice day today. Sorry about that.
You did a good job. You did good. You did good. But I want to go back to what you just said just a second ago. How many did you say? 802
Yep.
16-inch rounds in a 2-hour span. I mean, that's first of all, 2 hours shelling by a battleship is a hell of that's an eternity. 802 16-inch rounds. That is pumping them out there. And that's only from 3 battleships. I mean, that is pumping them out there. That's incredible. So as South Dakota, Indiana, and Big Mamie and their friends headed north to rejoin the fleet, Halsey detached another force, Task Group 34.8.2, under the command of Rear Admiral Oscar Badger, to shell the Nihon Steel Company and Wanishi Iron Works facilities therein. The task group under Badger was detached the night of the 14th for the run into a place called Muroran. The approach to the target area was audacious, no surprise because it's Bill Halsey, as it would require a 3-hour run in and a 3-hour run out with land on 3 sides of the task group. Speed was of the utmost priority, thus the fastest battleships afloat were chosen for this particular run. USS Iowa, BB-61, Missouri, BB-63, and the brand spanking new USS Wisconsin, BB-64, were selected for the strike, as were the light cruisers Atlanta, CL-104, and Dayton, CL-105, as well as 8 destroyers. Riding in his flagship Missouri, Halsey was particularly interested to see the results of this show, and you know he was. You know he was
Mhm.
salivating at seeing this. Like Kamaishi before, Nihon was a valuable target. The factories in the town were the second largest producers of coke and pig iron for Japan and had produced Yamato's massive 18.1-inch main battery barrels. The ride into the target was executed at night so as to limit visibility of the battle wagons and their escorts as much as possible. Just before dawn on the 15th, the task group hove into view, Bill.
Yeah. And here's a fun fact, Seth. Admiral Oscar Badger, his call sign was Obi. And when he was sent after the Wanishi Iron Works facility, he became Obi-Wan. There's something I bet you didn't know. I just made that up. Sorry, folks. I couldn't. I couldn't resist. Help me, Obi-Wan. You're
Help
my
me,
only hope.
Obi-Wan.
All right, going back to it. All right. So at 0935, Badger gave the order to commence firing. Missouri's cruise book related, quote, toughened though they were to monsoons and other varieties of inclement weather, the Japanese felt something new raining down on them in a shower of 16-inch shells that lasted for 50 minutes. Admiral Badger wanted to stay around for a while longer, but Halsey, aware that his ships were boxed in, ordered the bombardment to stop after 50 minutes. However, in that 50-minute time span, Badger's group laid waste. 860 16-inch 50 caliber shells were fired at the targets. Badger's flagship Iowa hit the Nihon furnaces on the second salvo, and Missouri's gunfire, yes, that Missouri, resulted in a massive explosion, much to Halsey's delight, as Missouri was his flagship. So he had a front seat view of all this 50-yard line view. Wisconsin's ninth salvo also caused a terrific explosion. In short, in a short but incredibly destructive bombardment, over 2,500 houses in Muroran were destroyed by secondary fires caused by concussion. More than 2.5 months worth of coke was destroyed, and about 2 months worth of pig iron as well. The lack of a Japanese response convinced Halsey that the enemy was done and he could do whatever he wanted, which he did. Now, Seth, in Hollywood, 2.5 months worth of coke is a lot of coke.
Yes, it is. Yes, it is. But that is not the Coke that we're referring to
Oh, it's
here.
not?
No, it is
Okay.
not. It is not. It is not the white Coke. It is not. It is also not the Coke in bottles. It is the Coke and
Mhm.
coal that is used to stoke these furnaces that are
Yes. Okay. Sorry about that.
producing
I got confused. Yeah.
that are producing steel. And think about this for a second, though. But in all seriousness, think about this. So, when we're going and we're attacking Japan with our carrier forces, we're hitting mostly airfields, harbor facilities, things like that. We do hit the Musashino factory outside of Tokyo that the B-29s never could hit. But there are war-making facilities that we're hitting. Again, as I said, harbor facilities and things like that. And of course, the B-29s are, razing cities to the ground. But these are legitimate military targets. These are targets that are producing or were, or to some degree, producing steel and iron that are going to be
Mhm.
theoretically used to build new Japanese ships or tanks or whatever the case may be. So these are legitimate targets, and
Yeah.
go ahead.
No, what I was going to say is I grew up in a steel town, Seth, and when the steel mills in Youngstown, Ohio were shutting down, it was Japanese steel that was putting them out of business. And a lot of World War II veterans in my town found great irony in that.
Bet they did. I would bet they did. Sad day too, I would imagine.
Mhm.
So, just 2 days later, after the Muroran bombardment, Halsey unleashed the same force that attacked Muroran, this, of course, is the Iowas, with the addition of some friends. Iowa, Missouri, and Wisconsin were joined by Alabama, North Carolina, as well as the Royal Navy's battleship King George V, with Vice Admiral Sir Bernard Rawlings aboard, and two Brit destroyers, as well as the same screen the Muroran force had. The Brits would sail astern of the Americans and operate independently of their allies. So we've talked about the British here and there, but this is one of the first, well, this is the first time that British Royal Navy surface vessels, combat ships like KG-5 are involved in the war to this state with the Americans in the Pacific theater. So this is a relatively significant event here. But again, the battleships that are involved in this, just listen to this. Iowa, Missouri, Wisconsin, Alabama, North Carolina, and KG-5. That is a lot of firepower. I mean, that is significant. The
Yep.
addition of three more battleships and two more DDs made for an absolutely incredibly powerful force that were all bound for a target only 80 miles from Tokyo itself. Talk about ballsy. Halsey, ballsy,
Mhm.
ballsy, Halsey. But you're sending all these battle wagons 80 miles away from Tokyo. That takes a lot of guts, but it also, and
Mhm.
as I said before, it's a middle finger to the Japanese. There's no question here. So the target for this bombardment was the Hitachi factory, and then we've all heard of Hitachi before, God knows. Then, as now, the Hitachi was a major electronics producer for the Japanese military and another ripe target. Aside from the electronics, arms factories, steel mills, and copper mines were also in the target list. No matter how ripe the target, however, weather always plays a hand with anything in and around Japan, and this is no different here.
Mhm.
Weather around Hitachi on the night of the 17th of July was absolutely horrendous. Fog, haze, and pouring rain made visual observation next to impossible. Radar, however, did not care about weather, and neither did the American Night Combat Air Patrol. The brand new Essex class carrier, this is July 1945. Not to stop
Mhm.
myself, but I'm going to stop myself. This is July 1945, and the United States Navy is fielding a not only uh, brand new aircraft of all, varieties and shapes and sizes in terms of newer models of Hellcats and Corsairs and all this other stuff. A brand new battleship in the Wisconsin, last battleship the United States ever built, and another brand new aircraft carrier, and not just any aircraft carrier, an Essex class, the USS Bonhomme Richard CV-31, and her night air group CVGN-91 provided the air cover over the battleship force. So Admiral Badger directed that all fire be radar directed, and at 23:14 on July 17th, the battle wagons opened fire from a range of 30,000 yards. The targets were 9 industrial facilities within the area, with each battleship being assigned 1 or 2 targets, with some of them overlapping. And again, Bill, to go back to my comment I made just a second ago, July 1945, and we're still fielding brand new capital ships, not just
Mhm.
destroyers, capital ships. That's incredible.
Pretty incredible. But we didn't know when the war would end. Again, we said this
True,
before.
but still, yeah.
We're doing all of this to keep the Japanese on their heels because we fully intended to launch an amphibious invasion in October, November of this year with Olympic. And so, yeah, this keeps going. People say, well, how do you direct gunfire by radar when you're firing at shore targets? When you're close to the beach, close to shore, you can see the outline of the beach on your radar scope. And so by measuring known points, basically comparing your radar, painting the shoreline to your maps, your paper maps, you can measure distance and azimuth and things like that, and then direct your guns because you get a very good fix of where you are by radar fix. And once you know where you are, you just use the maps to direct it to the target. So it's pretty easy as long as you can see the shore and features of shore that you can identify with your radar. So the ensuing 50-minute bombardment over 1,206. Wow. I'm going to say that again. 1,206 16-inch shells were fired. An astonishing number when you think of the sheer work that was required for each round to be fired. Remember, you've got the pointy end you load. Then you got the powder bags that you load. Then you got to ram them with hydraulics into place. KG-5, the Royal Navy ship, gave a good account of herself as well. She fired 267 14-inch shells from her main battery. He said, Seth, this is the first time a British battleship fired in the Pacific. Is that correct?
Uh,
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, you
Yeah,
got me
yeah.
on that one because
No,
they were operating in the Indian. Well,
in the Indian Ocean.
honestly,
Yeah, yeah,
yeah, they were. But
yeah.
I'll be honest with you, I don't know. That's a damn good question. That's something we need to look up
Certainly
and come
against
up with an
mainland
answer.
Japan.
Oh yeah,
Yeah,
no doubt, no
certainly.
question there, no
And the
question.
ensuing 50-minute bombardment, we said that over 1,000. The KG-5 was a battle-tested ship and the first of her class, and the first modern British battleship design of the war. KG-5 had seen the Elephant more than once. In May 1941, KG-5 was part of the British Home Fleet and engaged along with battleship HMS Rodney, German battleship Bismarck. You've heard of her, where she pumped over 300 14-inch rounds at Bismarck, scoring multiple killing shots. Sent to the Pacific as part of Task Force 57 in March of 45, KG-5 provided yet another gun platform for the massive Allied fleet. Despite the lack of visual observation, Allied shell fire was fairly accurate. The accuracy rate was less than 50%, but what shells did hit did major damage. That's less than 50% is still a high percentage for these big guns.
Yes.
Many of the plants in and around Hitachi were damaged, some severely. Copper production in the area was wiped out completely, and the Hitachi mine essentially ceased to exist as a result of the shelling. The urban area of Hitachi was severely hit by high explosive shells fired from the battleships, multiple, causing multiple fires that spread rapidly throughout the area. That being said, actual damage done by the shelling may have been more severe than originally thought. A B-29 raid the next night leveled much of the area to the ground, thereby eliminating most of the evidence of the shelling the night before, Seth.
So after this bombardment, smaller, less successful bombardments occurred on July 18th and July 19th near Cape Nojima. Cruisers Topeka, CL-67, Duluth, CL-87, Oklahoma City, CL-91, and Atlanta, again, CL-104, along with 5 DDs, shelled the Cape after finding no surface ships to attack near Tokyo Bay. 240 rounds of 6-inch shells were thrown at various targets, which hit virtually nothing, but did affect Japanese morale, and we'll get to that later. Another raid on Shimizu on July 30th by Desron 25 also produced little in terms of net gain in terms of Japanese shipping, but did do some effective shelling deep inside Suruga Wan in a short 7 minute, hold on to this, 7 minute bombardment that badly damaged an oil refinery and aluminum plant, destroying some 118 buildings in 7 minutes. The DDs fired over 1,100 rounds in 7 minutes, which is absolutely mind-boggling. I
Mm.
mean, talk about throwing it out there. Goodness.
Yeah.
On God dang. I mean, that is a lot of firepower in 7 minutes.
Mhm.
On July the 29th, Halsey detached Admiral Shea Frost battle wagons again, along with KG-5, with the addition of USS St. Paul, CA-73, and 3 Royal Navy DDs. Once again, Bonhomme Richard's Night Air Group provided combat air patrol, as well as observation, and corrected the fall of shot. The force zeroed in on Hamamatsu, where their targets were the Japanese musical instrument company's factory that was producing airplane propellers, and it was first taken under fire at 23:19 hours from a range of 20,000 yards by KG-5, who was given the first salvo honors. Bonhomme Richard's Combat Air Patrol communicated with KG-5 throughout her bombardment and corrected the battle wagon's gunnery as she dropped 265 14-inch rounds on a target in a 27-minute span. That is also throwing it out there. In a sad but true piece of history, King George V's bombardment of Hamamatsu would prove to be the final time that a British battleship ever fired a round in anger. Think about that, Bill. Now, you know a lot of Royal
Mhm.
Navy sailors, and the history of battleships and the Royal Navy goes back beyond Nelson. This is the last time in that Navy's history that a battleship ever fired a round in anger.
Yeah, not a warship, but a battleship. Yeah,
Right.
because Falklands, warships did fire some rounds.
Sure.
But yeah, it is incredible, isn't it? but
It
it's
is.
still
It
the
is.
Royal Navy. And when you
Mhm.
look at the history of the Royal Navy and their reliance and imposed importance of the big gun capital ship, it's stark that this was the last time a battleship flying the Union Jack ever loosed her main battery at an enemy. A chapter of naval history had closed, maybe forever. I don't know. We'll see how things evolve in the next 20 years, but I'm hoping, and wherever the Imperial Government Railway Station, the Japanese Imperial Government Railway Station, was hit by shell fire. The locomotive works were destroyed, as were three other facilities. Rail lines were shot to pieces by the battleships. I know USS Barb wishes they were there to lend a hand with blowing up rail cars or engines. And the damage dealt was so severe that the rail lines closed for nearly 70 hours. They were really good at restoring railway after damage. This time it took them 70 hours. The least effective of all the battleship shellings militarily, the Hamamatsu raid caused more morale damage on the already shaky Japanese populace, Seth.
So they're not done with the shooting the living crap out of the Japanese shoreline because they're going to hit Kamaishi again on August the 9th, 1945. That's an important date in history. So, believing wrongly that that the first attack on Kamaishi had not inflicted a lot of damage, Halsey sent Shayfrost battle wagons in again to lay waste to the steel mills yet again. South Dakota, Indiana, Massachusetts, Quincy, Boston, Chicago, St. Paul, plus 9 destroyers, and the Royal Navy's light cruiser HMS Newfoundland, New Zealand light cruiser HMNZS Gambia, and 3 British destroyers all set courses for Kamaishi 2 days after the Hiroshima bombing. Of the second attack on Kamaishi, Halsey later stated, and I quote, "By now, our contempt for Japan's defenses was so thorough that our prime consideration in scheduling this bombardment was the convenience of the radio audience back home," unquote. And indeed, the United States Navy recorded the bombardment and sent it back home so the people at home could hear U.S. Navy battleships shelling the Japanese home islands, Bill.
Yeah, it's incredible. Well, how far have we come in the last 3 years?
Goodness.
At 11, yeah, at 11:02 that same morning, you say, wait a minute, when did the Hiroshima bomb drop? Yes, it was August 6th, and this is August 9th. At 11:02 that same morning, Boxcar dropped the second atomic weapon on Nagasaki. And earlier that morning, the Soviets invaded Manchuria. August 9th was a busy day, and Shafroth's, I'm going to keep calling him that, force kept it that way. At 12:47, the battleships opened fire from a range of 14,000 yards. In broad daylight, the battleships and their escorts paraded in front of the Japanese coastline, shooting at will, hence the name of this episode, Seth. Japanese AAA was somewhat heavy, dropping a couple of the American Combat Air Patrol aircraft and cruiser scout planes. The ships made 4 slow passes up and down the coast for 2 hours, absolutely pounding the inshore targets with even more effectiveness than the first raid had done. 803 16-inch shells, 1,383 8-inch shells, and 733 6-inch shells were fired in the fusillade. The New Zealand ship Gambia fired the final shots of the attack as the Allied ships withdrew from the area. And I've got some friends from the country of Gambia, not the ship of Gambia, Seth. But again, this is all happening after the second atomic bomb is dropped, but before the Japanese agreed to surrender.
Yeah, because we don't know what the heck's going on. And James Scott had said when we had him on talking about the strategic bombing campaign, he said
Mhm.
that if you and we're going to do an episode on the bombs plural, um, talk
Another
about
episode.
right, yeah, where we talk about the missions themselves, and but the Curtis LeMay's people, viewed the atomic missions as just another mission. It wasn't anything, I mean, yeah, it was significant, but it wasn't anything different than any other raid. So it was just another raid. And that's exactly how we viewed it at that time. So yet again, Shafroth's force beat the absolute snot out of Kamaishi. After withdrawing from the area, there wasn't much left to shoot at if they had come back yet again. Fires were widespread across the area. Many air raid shelters took direct 16-inch shell hits, which caused large amounts of civilian casualties in the neighborhood of 280 souls. Over 1,400 houses and buildings were destroyed either by shell fire or the resulting fires, and what remained of the pig iron not destroyed in the first bombardment in July was destroyed this go round. As had happened in July, unfortunately, American prisoners of war were also killed in the shelling. 42 more were killed by Allied shell fire, as were numerous Korean slave laborers. Just a few days later, the Japanese surrendered. So, you know, this this is kind of an odd episode, I think, because we've done a lot. God knows, we've done, well over 100 episodes, and we talk about battles and we talk about people and biographies and campaigns, and this isn't a campaign, and it's not a battle, and it's not a biography. It's short bombardments, and which,
Mhm.
to the regular, historian can sit there and go, well, that's kind of boring. And what effect does it have? But it actually has a great deal of effect this late
Mhm.
in the war, not necessarily on the Japanese military, but on the Japanese people. But the goal
Right.
of these bombardments, it's all encompassing. So it is an important aspect of the war, isn't it?
It is, and we titled this episode Parade of Destruction, but another appropriate title might have been Impunity.
Hmm.
Impunity, because that's really the right word for what we were able to do here. We were operating with impunity. At this point in the war, again, strategically, I always pull it back to that. The real threat to the Japanese leadership was the Japanese people and the possibility of a revolution overthrow because of what they were going through, right? And the atomic bombs just really drove that over the tipping point. And the government, we're going to talk about this separately. We've talked about it in two episodes prior, one with Rich Rank, um, one with Sam Cox. We're going to talk about it again. But at this point, the Japanese government realizes we can't hold, we, the government, not we, the country, we, the government, can't hold out any longer. And there is a difference, folks. So there is a difference between the country and the government. So the goal of the initial bombardments was to draw out the Japanese aerial defenses. The Japanese, who had deduced that the U.S. Navy may indeed try a tactic like this, did not take the bait whatsoever. A grand total of two Japanese aircraft rose to meet the ships throughout July and August. Halsey's assumption that the Japanese air power was dead due to lack of presence was wrong, although neither he nor any American or their allies knew it, because more than 12,000 Japanese aircraft lay in wait for the final defenses if the Americans had landed on Kyushu in October. 12,000 aircraft, which all of which would likely have been kamikaze aircraft, all of which would likely have targeted our troop transports. So when I say the Japanese leadership had it, although the Japanese as a nation may not, that's what I mean, Seth.
Yep. What the raids, even though they didn't accomplish the goal of drawing out aerial defenses, like you just said, what they did achieve, however, was the destruction, as we were talking about earlier, of a vast amount of Japan's remaining steel industry. Many of the factories that were shelled were operating at a reduced capability before the attacks due to shortages of coke, thanks to your silent service. Nevertheless, the factories were almost utterly destroyed by the shelling, rendering them completely useless with or without the needed coking coal. The shellings affected, and this is the important part, and this goes exactly back to what you were just talking about. It affected more than just the military targets. The morale of the Japanese populace in the area and beyond, because these people eventually did get the hell out of Dodge and they'd go to the bigger cities and they'd say, guess what just happened to my town? Gravely was affected gravely by the American shellings. The first Kamaishi bombardment was the first indicator. Post-war, Japanese stated emphatically that the shellings at Kamaishi were far more terrifying than the air raids had been, and this is coming from people who had been subject to both. The Japanese were aware that the B-29s had come from long distance bases. You know, the average Japanese civilian has no clue that they're coming from Tinian, but they got a pretty good idea that they're coming from the Marianas. In other words, they're coming from far away. But the battleships just off the coast, and in many cases, especially after the battle wagons drew closer, because with each pass they'd get a little bit closer as they're coming round and round and round, they're drawing a little bit closer and shore. The Japanese civilians could see these leviathans with the naked eye. And it is abundantly clear that all the propaganda that they had been fed for years, that, you know, the Japanese Navy's sinking every freaking American ship afloat, is a pack of lies. Because here is this just small portion, frankly, of the American fleet sitting just offshore. I can see these guys, and they are shooting the ever-loving hell out of my coast. Oh, and by the way, we're not doing anything to stop them. Nothing at
Hmm.
all. That is a tremendous impact. It has a tremendous impact on the Japanese populace morale, Bill.
It does, yeah. No amount of Japanese malarkey propaganda could ever cover the fact that American and later Allied warships sailed within eyesight. They could see them of the coast unmolested by Japanese defenses. When the civilians saw this, they knew the war was over without a doubt. After the Muroran raid by the Iowas, the Japanese defense minister formally apologized to the people of Muroran for not doing anything to stop the American shelling. After Hamamatsu, despite the less than stellar American shell fire, over 30,000 Japanese fled the area. All over the country, Japanese are fleeing from the Tokyo fire bombings to Hiroshima, Nagasaki, and all the towns that are getting conventional bombs dropped on them. And now these towns, over 30,000 Japanese fleeing due to warship shelling, not aircrafts dropping bombs from 1,000 miles away. The fact that 2,000 16-inch shells, 2,000-pound shells, were screaming through the air like freight trains unnerved the civilians more than anything previously had. The factories that had not been touched or had been slightly damaged suffered due to absenteeism. They were running away, Seth.
Yeah. Yeah, they were taking off. Casualties in terms of people killed, these are all figured post-war, ring in at about 1,739 Japanese killed in all the shellings, with 46 still listed missing to this day. A further 1,497 were wounded. While a pittance compared to the B-29 raids, as we know, hundreds of thousands of people were killed, the bombardments did indeed have an effect on the war. No, it did not shorten the war, but they may have shortened the war had the war lasted longer than it did. And to your point, Bill, 30,000 Japanese are fleeing the Muroran or Hamamatsu area after the battleship shellings, and these are people that had been under aerial attack multiple times, and it was the battleship shelling that drove them the hell out of there because they could, as you said, they could see these guys with their naked eyes, so they know that, hey, the enemy is right here. They're right here. The naval bombardments of Japan's coast did not bring the Japanese to the peace table. They did not. They did not force Hirohito to try and seek peace. Had Hirohito not caved, the Japanese would have fought on. The Big Six did not care about battleships shelling the coast, but the civilians did. And that brings up the question that you proposed just a minute ago. Would the populace have revolted had the war lasted longer than it did? And John Parshall and you and I talked about this to some degree. And, with the assumed famine, which is really no other way to put it, that would have come this winter, which would have been the winter of 1945, due to the rice shortages, submarines sinking everything that floated, the aerial bombings, now this. Would the population have said, either you sue for peace or we're coming to sue for peace? And I think that's a
Mm-hmm.
very legitimate question that If ships shelling a target for 50 minutes can drive 30,000 people from their homes, that is significant. That is a
Mhm.
significant event.
Yeah. Remember that the sea is what feeds this population to a large extent, the sea and rice. Okay. And you've got 30,000 fleeing mouths declaring that the war is over. Here, you've got hundreds of thousands of fleeing people from other cities declaring that the war is over. From a Japanese civilian standpoint, if I can't live within 15 miles of the coastline, I can't feed my family. Yeah, I'm going to be pretty agitated at my government. And people say, and I said, we could not effectively blockade Japan. And that is true. But if you drive everybody out of big cities and big towns along the coastline through raids like this, it's assumed that there was no atomic bomb, because at this point, most people didn't even know about the atomic bomb. Let's assume that the atomic bomb didn't give the Japanese leadership the excuse they needed to explain why they were going to surrender. It wasn't the Americans that beat us. It was this new magic technology that beat us. That's the excuse they were given with the atomic bombs. Assume all of that never happens. You've got people fleeing away from the thing that feeds them, the ocean. Yeah, it's going to add to that, the vigor of making this thing end. That's my opinion, Seth.
I think you're 100% right. I mean, again, just falling back on what you said, 30,000 people are leaving their homes, their livelihood, their means of nutrition, whatever you want to say, to escape this. That's significant. And we've already said, millions of people leave Tokyo after the fire bombings and they go out into the countryside. You know, they're starving as it is, and they're going to starve even worse as it gets on. At some point, I believe that there would have been a tipping point with the populace, and,
Mm,
and this certainly adds uh, vigor to that argument that
mm,
they'd
yeah.
had enough. They'd had enough. They didn't believe the lies anymore.
I will say, though, that knowing what Nimitz knew and what Halsey knew when they knew it, this was the right call.
Oh yeah,
These naval bombardments was the right call, and they would have and should have continued if Japan had not surrendered when they did.
agree 100%. As you've said 100 times, we didn't know that the war was going in. Bill Halsey didn't know anything about an atomic bomb being dropped on Nagasaki. He didn't know anything about that, nor did he care. He didn't know what the hell. I sincerely doubt he knew what an atomic bomb was on
Right.
August 9th, 1945. One of the only guys in the Navy that did know, that wasn't riding one of those B-29s, and of course I'm referring to, the naval officers that were aboard, was Chester Nimitz. He's the only one that did
Mhm.
know, or one of the only ones that did know. But, this was absolutely the right call. You're going to knock out the infrastructure. You're going to knock out the war making ability of the Japanese people. Oh, and by the way, you're also going to demoralize the people, because 2,000-pound shell screaming in like a freight train, that's going to scare the hell out of people. And that's exactly what it did.
Mhm.
So it's absolutely would have continued, and it absolutely was the right call. So, Bill, anything else you want to add to this, I think, relatively unknown aspect of the Pacific War?
Yeah, I'm happy at Halsey's performance here, because we've been saying in the last few episodes that the war kind of outgrew him, or you know, but here this is his environment here,
Yeah.
so he's going to perform well in a situation like this. So yeah, I'm glad of that.
Yeah, we're going to talk about Bill Halsey again next week when we cover the Kure naval raids, which is essentially the last Navy action of the war. And
Mm,
no, we're not done with the show, but it's just how things are falling out. And then, of course, we got to get to the Indianapolis and the bomb and all that other good stuff. We got a
mm,
lot of stuff coming forward here. But
we
so,
do.
well, with that, we want to thank you very much for listening and or watching this conversation. Please subscribe to the Unauthorized History of the Pacific War podcast. You receive your podcast. If you got a question or comment, send us an email at unauthorizedpacificpodcast@gmail.com. Once again, my name is Seth Perrin, and I want to thank you very much for listening and or watching. Bill, this was a good one. Bring
Yeah, it
us
was a
home.
good one.
Yeah.
See you again, hopefully with a better voice next week.